Like with any genre, mixing indie rock comes with its own fair share of challenges that will test your mixing skills. So today we'll be breaking down this track, going over some key areas and the different problems you'll likely face when mixing this style of music. And by the end of the video, you'll know how to best tackle each one. So a huge part of any indie rock or pop song is the drum sound. These can vary a lot from song to song. You can have something like this that's more laid back and lo-fi. Or something that's more upfront. In this particular case, it's much more the latter. So I think first identifying what kind of drum sound you're working with, or what the artist has in mind, is a good first step in the mixing process, as this will dictate a lot of your other mixing decisions later on. Now the beat itself is just a very simple, steady groove that is really holding the song together and letting every other track play around it. So keeping that in mind from a mixing perspective, we just want to add to that consistent sound through the use of a few different effects. As you can see on screen, I've kept things super simple and I'm only really using a handful of plugins on the key tracks that make up this drum mix. I'll play you a quick A/B of the drum sound before and after so you can get a feel for how this processing is affecting the drum sound. So the key thing for this drum mix in particular is really the use of compression. Again, this is mostly being used to add more consistency and help glue each kit piece together so that things sound like one cohesive instrument. My main use of compression is on the drum bus itself, using this VCA compressor. These specific settings are being used so that every time the snare is played, the compression kicks in harder and keeps the drum sounding nice and leveled, so that nothing pokes out too much in the context of the full mix. So the settings being used is a slow attack set at 30 milliseconds and a fast release set at 0.1. Then we have the ratio set at 2:1. This means for an input level 2 dB over the threshold, 1 dB will be the output. And then one of the most important controls here is a high pass filter. What this does is it prevents the compression triggering from the low end frequencies. So when you have a very bassy sounding kick, for example, it can sometimes trigger the compression too much and cause it to over compress your signal, especially if you're doing it on a drum bus. So setting this high pass filter further up means that the compressor will look at anything above the set filter to engage compression instead of the frequency range as a whole. That doesn't mean it won't compress the low frequencies, the entire frequency range is still being compressed, it's just that it's no longer looking at the low frequencies as a signal for the onset of compression. I'll play the drum mix with and without this, so you can hear how this helps shape the drum sound. And I think this is even more noticeable within the context of the whole mix, as without this compression, the drums kind of poke out too much in a distracting way. The next step for me is to look at the bass, and more specifically, how this is interacting with the drums. We've got that drum consistency thanks to our use of mix bus compression, so it's now figuring out how the bass fits into this equation. For this song, we've got quite a busy bass line that's being played on a hollow body style bass guitar. A key characteristic of this bass sound is that they tend to sound quite muted, and they don't have a great deal of sustain to each note. It's more in line with the sound of an upright bass, as opposed to a typical precision or jazz bass. And that sound actually makes things a lot easier to mix in this case, as it means that the drums are really going to take up the majority of the low end focus of this track, and the bass can be mixed above this. So looking at my bass chain, I really didn't have to do too much to get this bass working with the drum tracks. Starting with my EQ, I just wanted to knock out a little more low end and leave this for the kick drum, and also take out some of the high end because I really wanted to lean into more of that muted, almost upright sounding bass tone, so that's what these high and low shelves are achieving here. Then I've just got this simple multi-band compression setup that's really there to help level out the bass from note to note. You'll notice that sometimes certain notes on a bass guitar have the tendency to jump out at you more than others, so that's all this band is there to do. It's just catching those odd peaks and tucking them back in whenever they poke out too much. The main setting to look at here is the range knob, which limits the amount of compression that takes place, and the threshold, which will just set the level for compression. So the more you turn it counterclockwise, the more this specific frequency band will be compressed. And then the final piece of this bass chain is RBass. If you've never used this plugin or a plugin like this before, the idea behind it is based on psychoacoustic studies into how our ear perceives bass. It creates harmonics that trick our ears into hearing deeper bass than what actually exists. though the weird thing about this is that it's creating them above the fundamental note and not below, even though it sounds like the low end specifically is being boosted. Now this plugin can be really intense in its sound, so I'd always recommend using it at low levels to start with. It's really great for emphasizing the bass sound, and I'm sure you'd even notice a difference on your phone speaker when I A/B this on and off. If you'd like a free alternative to this plugin, you could try Love End by Analog Obsession, which I've heard is a pretty good substitute for R-Bass. And all that's really left here is the guitars. Now the cool thing in this production is a mixture of upfront acoustics with these more distant sounding fuzz guitars. Together they create this kind of psychedelic effect as they're playing the same parts, but the spatial difference between them affects the way that our ears are perceiving them in the mix. So keeping in line with that, I've pretty much done all my processing with this one single plugin on the acoustic guitar tracks. And it might seem weird to use a plugin that's intended for vocals here, but I often find these types can be really helpful for anything you want to bring forward in a mix, likely because that's what you're typically doing when processing most vocals. So I'm pushing some of the compression just to even out the slides between each note, and then I'm also making use of the ambient effects within this plugin, just so the guitars don't sound too dry within the mix. And then like I mentioned, there's also this pair of fuzz tracks that are playing the same thing as the acoustics. So really all I'm doing is taking out a lot of low end that isn't needed for these specific tracks, along with using a bit of soothe to smooth out some of those nastier frequencies that are being brought up by the fuzz pedal. So altogether, these guitar parts now sound like this. I've tried countless options to improve my mixers and they always fell short. That's why I partnered with the Sage Audio membership. It's the only all-in-one platform that makes your mixers sound like professional songs. The membership includes unlimited mixing feedback, direct one-on-one mentorship, in-depth mixing and mastering courses, 50 free mastered songs per year, and a lot more. Every day, I see huge wins from the members, noticing a massive improvement in their mixers after joining. Watch the free membership video with the link in the description.